Got 100 steps to go. Tonight I'll make it 99. By rayrae118, Chapter 7. Neville couldn't form a sentence. He actually could not break his brain form a coherent sentence. How? What? He stuttered, staring at the sight in front of him. Alice and Frank beamed, drinking in the sight of the sun they hadn't been able to recognize in nearly 16 years. Augusta was also smiling widely, but it was Minerva who turned to Harry, a shocked expression on her face. Harry! Did you? Harry nodded sheepishly. I've been studying and researching for over a year. Jason helped me learn legilimency, and I've been practicing. Ginny helped me a lot. So did all of you. He turned to look at his friends. When you let me past your defences, I could learn how to navigate someone else's mind. He looked down, and Ginny snaked an arm around his waist. I knew there had to be a way to reverse the effects of the curse. Neville finally snapped out of his shock, and stepped forward, hesitantly. Mum? Dad? He asked, his voice soft. Alice smiled through her tears and opened her arms. Slowly, Neville walked forward and let his mum embrace him for the first time in 16 years. Frank folded his arms around the two of them, relishing in the feeling of his family being complete. The rest of the group gave them a few minutes, waiting until they pulled apart before the others moved in, welcoming Frank and Alice back, and congratulating them on their recovery. Sirius and Remus were incredibly happy to be able to speak with the two again, having been friends in school. They also fought together in the First War with Dumbledore's order, and Sirius had worked with them after graduating from the Auror Academy. Amelia was next, remembering the Longbottoms from their stint in the Aurors as well. Minerva embraced her former students, still amazed that they were here. The rest of the group hadn't been quite as close, but they greeted Frank and Alice warmly, before everyone sat back down. Neville was so close he was practically sitting in his mother's lap, but he refused to let go, almost fearful that if he did, he'd wake up to find that this had all been a dream. Alice and Frank certainly didn't seem to mind. The rest of the afternoon was spent in joy and laughter, with only a hint of seriousness as they gave Frank and Alice an overview of their side of the war. Not much was needed, since Harry, Ginny and Augusta had caught them up for the most part at St. Mungo's. The two Longbottoms also gave everyone a summary of what they had been up to since being healed. The healers wanted to keep us in the hospital for a few days, just to make sure everything was fine, Frank explained. We were only just released from St. Mungo's today. We stopped by the manor to freshen up and change, and then came straight here. He looked apologetically at Neville. I'm sorry that we didn't tell you immediately. We didn't want you seeing us in the hospital. And Mum thought it would make a nice surprise if we showed up to this end of summer party. Neville smiled at his dad. It was the most amazing present ever, he said, completely forgiving everyone who knew for not telling him. He would have liked to know immediately, but he understood why they didn't want him to have to see them at the hospital, and it had been a wonderful gift. He had spent 16 years going to that hospital to visit them, and now that they had a say in the matter, they didn't want him to have to see them like that. It would have been worse if they had told him that his parents were healed, but he couldn't see them for another week. Alice beamed and pulled him to her side. She wasn't sure she would ever be able to let him go. The twilight fell and the group broke up, each heading for their homes. Fred and George said their goodbyes first, since they had left a few new inventions on the simmer for the day, and needed to see how they were doing. They were also anticipating a lot of business the next day, since it was the last day of summer. Bill and Fleur were the next to depart, followed by Cyrus, Astoria, Daphne, then Blaze, Luna, Ted and Andromeda, and Remus and Tonks. Hermione gave Ron a kiss before she headed home, and the rest of the Weasleys, minus Ginny, departed. Ginny promised she'd be home soon, but she had finally managed to convince Harry to talk with Sirius and Minerva about their conversation with Sharptooth. He didn't want to tell anyone, but Ginny was stubborn, and thought that the adults should know. Harry had asked Sirius to stay behind, so Neville gave Susan a kiss before she left with Amelia, then blushed under his parents' scrutiny. Yeah, Susan's my girlfriend, he admitted, Alice squealed, reaching out to hug her son. Oh, I'm so proud of you, Neville. I can't wait to hear all about it. Neville's blush deepened. Harry stepped forward. Frank, Alice, if you'd like to come over tomorrow. We usually do some defence training in the morning. I'm sure Neville would love to show you how good he is. Frank nodded eagerly. We'd love to see that. We'll definitely be there. Augusta rested a hand on her son's shoulder. It's time to go home, she said, the smile still on her face. It had been there for nearly a week, ever since her son and daughter-in-law had been healed. Frank nodded, and the Longbottoms said their goodbyes. Augusta stepped through the flue first, followed by Frank and then Alice. When Neville was the only one left, he quickly stepped forward and grasped Harry in a tight hug. Harry awkwardly put his arms around his friend and hugged him back. Thank you, Neville whispered, squeezing his eyes shut to stop the tears from falling. Thank you so much. Harry smiled. Anytime. Neville stepped back, wiping his eyes, and then followed his family through the flue. Harry fidgeted under Minerva's steady gaze. I just wanted to give him his parents back, he tried to explain. Minerva sighed and shook her head. You've just done the impossible, and you're acting like you think you need to apologize. She smiled. Harry, you did a wonderful thing, and I'm very proud of you. Can you tell me more about how you did it? I highly doubt just knowing legitimacy was enough. Harry bit his lip and shook his head ruefully, before telling Minerva and Sirius about how he and Ginny had done it together, and how their bond had helped them succeed. Minerva's smile widened as he finished. I'm very proud of you, she said again. Both of you, she glanced at Ginny. You've done a truly great thing. Harry blushed and let his... What was she now? He was 17 and officially an adult, so she wasn't really his guardian anymore. But she definitely wouldn't be going back to just being a professor. Should he call her his aunt? Anyway, he let Minerva hug him. Sirius then clapped him on the shoulder before they headed back inside. Once in the sitting room, Minerva raised an eyebrow, seeing that Sirius was making no move to depart. What's going on? She asked curiously. Harry and Ginny shared a look before Harry sighed and told the adults about the part of the conversation with Sharptooth that was the most concerning. Minerva hissed angrily about hearing their theories on Albus's decisions. Bastard! She growled angrily. Sirius glanced at her. Haven't we already figured that out by now? He asked rhetorically. Minerva glared at him, but the man just shrugged and turned back to the teenagers. He was just as angry, but honestly he wasn't that surprised. Dumbledore had already done a lot of horrible things. This was just one more piece to the puzzle. Harry took a deep breath. The good thing is that the piece of Voldemort in me is gone. Minerva raised an eyebrow, thinking about whether or not she should ask about how that had happened. She looked at the couple, and then decided she didn't want to know. Well, we can at least be grateful for that, she said decisively. Thank you for telling us, Harry. Ginny. Harry nodded quickly. Try not to punish Dumbledore too much, he implored, causing Sirius and Ginny to chuckle, while Minerva just looked at him. Harry allowed himself a small smile. I know he has a lot to answer for, but as much as I hate to admit it, we do need him. For the war effort. He's an important figurehead. Minerva sighed and nodded her agreement. Very well. I will not turn him into a parakeet, she promised. He tilted his head to the side. Well, not yet, he allowed. He then glanced at Ginny and amended his statement. Maybe just not permanently. And only if I can see it happen. Ginny quickly indicated her approval, while Sirius guffawed. Minerva allowed herself a small secretive smile, before Sirius and Ginny headed for their homes, and Minerva and Harry headed up to bed. Alice and Frank were impressed by the skills their son and his friends showed, and were very happy to tell them. They had been accomplished aurors in their day, but they knew these teenagers could have given them a run for their money. You're brilliant! Frank beamed as Neville came up to them around noon. Everyone was taking a break to get some lunch, and then they would all return home to make sure they had finished packing for the trip back to Hogwarts the next morning. Neville smiled, drinking in the feeling of being complimented by his parents. His parents! He still couldn't believe that they were here, in front of him, looking at him and seeing him. How many times had he had to force down his disappointment at going to St. Mungo's to visit his parents, and having them look straight through him. And yet, here they were. Neville really didn't know how he had lucked out into having such a good friend like Harry, but he knew that he would stand by the Potter Lord until the end of time. They all headed up to the dining room together, and fell upon the fantastic lunch spread the elves had set up. Sirius and Minerva were both absent, dealing with their respective duties, so it was just the teenagers, Frank and Alice. The two Longbottom adults winced at the sight of the newspaper lying on the table as they took their seats. The front page story from the Prophet that morning had been about their miraculous recovery. St. Mungo's had released a statement, not having much choice after word had spread just a few days earlier on about Frank and Alice's change in status. They knew they couldn't remain hidden for much longer, but it was annoying to have their private lives splashed all over the paper for the world to see. Harry saw their distaste and glanced at the paper as well. He grimaced. "Sorry," he apologised, picking up the paper and handing it to Tippy, who had just appeared in that moment. The elf nodded understandingly and popped away, ostensibly to place the paper in Harry's bedroom. "I forgot to put that away this morning." Alice smiled. "That's all right, Harry. We're just not fond of the media's way of making everything that should be private a public matter." Harry nodded, sighing. "I know how you feel. Why can't they just leave well enough alone? At least the hospital get my name out of it. Can you imagine the circus that would be involved if they let that slip?" The Longbottoms smiled. "I must say, it is very strange, seeing how enamoured the public is with you." Frank commented. "When we last saw you, you were about to go into hiding with your parents. So much has changed." "Too much," Ginny muttered. Alice glanced at the Weasley girl and nodded soberly. "True, but you've grown into wonderful adults. I remember seeing you as just a baby, Ginny. Your mother had just given birth when we were forced to retreat behind the Avadalius. We worked together in the Order, so we've all seen you Weasleys at one point or another." They ate in silence for a few minutes, before Hermione began questioning Frank and Alice on what was next. "Have you thought about what you'll do now that you've recovered?" she asked curiously. Frank smiled. "We were going to speak with—" He looked at Alice. "Who's head of the DMLE now?" Alice shrugged. "Your guess is as good as mine," she reminded him. Harry chuckled. "Rufus Scrimgeour. He took over for Amelia when she was elected minister. Kingsley Shacklebolt is the head Auror." Frank nodded. "Thanks. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the management structure." Harry smiled. "Kingsley is part of our circle. He wasn't here yesterday because he had to work, but he's a good man, and a better wizard. You'll like him." He sighed softly. "I don't know too much about Scrimgeour, but Sirius says he's better as a politician than he is as an Auror. According to him, Scrimgeour's always looking for an angle." Alice frowned. "That doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement." Harry shook his head. "Like I said, I don't really know him, but I get the feeling from what Sirius said that he would do whatever it took to ensure people believe in the system, whether or not it's doing any good." He shuddered. "I don't think I'd like to see him in charge of the ministry. At least not during a war like what we're facing now." He looked at Ginny. "Can you imagine what he'd try to do to get me to promote the ministry, or some crap like that?" Ginny looked horrified at the thought, while Hermione pursed her lips. "I'm not sure that's—" Harry glanced at her and raised an eyebrow, and she stopped talking, thoroughly chastised even without Harry saying a word. He was right, of course. Some people could be unscrupulous over their desire to have the boy who lived supporting them. Some didn't even care whether or not he did. It was enough to just attach to the name and claim he endorsed it. Frank cleared his throat. "Well, we'll speak with Shacklebolt and Scrimgeour, probably after we see you lot off to school. We want to help in any way we can, and being Aurors was something we quite enjoyed while we joined up. We'll see what they have to say about physical requalification. So don't you worry about us being bored without you around." He grinned at Neville, who smiled back. When they finished eating, they all dispersed to their respective homes to finish packing, promising to see each other the next morning at the platform. The Longbottoms waited until everyone else had departed, wanting to speak to Harry alone. Neville took a deep breath once Ginny, the last of the group, stepped through the flue. Harry, you're the best friend I could have asked for. I can't believe you managed to find a cure. In my wildest dreams, I never thought. Harry shook his head, smiling. Yes, you did, Nev. You told me that you would always have hope as long as they were breathing. And you're one of my best friends. I would do anything for you. Neville sniffed, and Frank and Alice smiled broadly. I know that we already said it, and the alliance has been formalised for years. But the ancient and noble house of Longbottom will stand beside you, Lord Potter. We are forever in your debt. Frank felt the need to formally state it, even though he knew the alliance between their houses had been firm for over 500 years, and unspoken but agreed upon for centuries before that. Harry nodded seriously. Our alliance will always remain strong, he said firmly, but like I told Augusta, you don't owe me anything. I would give anything to have my parents back, but that's something I can't change. What I could change was giving Neville the same gift. Neville gave Harry a hug, and then stepped through the flue. Frank shook Harry's hand, and Alice followed her son's example by hugging the teenager, before they too left. Harry was up early the next morning, making sure that he had everything packed and ready to go by the time they were supposed to leave for London. Minerva couldn't be there to see him off, though he knew she wanted to be, but the fact of the matter was that she had to be at school. Dumbledore had recovered, but he still wasn't completely healed, so she was taking on a lot of the headmaster's duties. Remus and Tonks flew over at 10 o'clock, followed soon after by Sirius and Susan. Amelia, he told them, would be meeting them there. Harry was almost surprised, since as the minister, Amelia hadn't been able to see Susan off for the last few years. But then he supposed she wouldn't miss seeing her niece off for her very last school year ever. A few minutes later, Kingsley joined them and told them that they were running a little late, so they couldn't leave just yet. Harry and Susan looked at each other and rolled their eyes, completely over the idea of having a guard, but knowing they couldn't say no. Finally, almost 20 minutes later, they were able to leave. They met up with Amelia and 5 Auras on the other side of the flue, and hurried to platform 9 3/4 immediately. On the other side of the barrier, they quickly found the group of Weasleys and rushed over to say hello. Fred and George had taken the morning off work to see their younger brother and sister off, as had Bill and Fleur. It was Ron's 7th year, and after all, quite a milestone. Arthur was there as well, which was surprising since he couldn't normally take time off to come with his family to the train. But like his sons, he wanted to see Ron off for the last time. He hadn't managed to do so with the twins or Percy, but since he had been able to finagle the time off this year, he had taken it wholeheartedly. Harry and Susan were quickly absorbed into the group of redheads, while the Aura stood guard. Over the next 10 minutes, Daphne, Blaise, Luna and Hermione joined them, along with their respective families. Harry was starting to get worried at not seeing Neville yet, when a sudden increase in chatter around them drew his attention. He looked around and saw the people pointing and staring at a trio quickly walking towards them. All 3 Longbottoms looked equally annoyed at the attention, and did their best to ignore it as they joined the group of friends. "Don't they have anything better to do?" Frank grumbled, glancing back at the crowd, still watching them. No one answered, knowing that nothing they said would be what he wanted to hear. The train whistled and Molly teared up, hugging her youngest son tightly. "Oh, my boy, I can't believe this is your last year," she sobbed. Ron turned red but hugged his mother back, knowing that she loved him and happy to indulge her. The other parents and guardians turned to their own children and said goodbye. Frank and Alice immediately pulled Neville into a tight hug, both shedding a few tears. "Oh, I wish we could have had more time together," Alice muttered. Neville nodded, and he pulled back. "I'll write at least twice a week," he promised. Frank smiled and grasped his son's shoulder tightly. "As will we, and we'll come and visit every Hogsmeade weekend." Neville grinned and nodded eagerly. When Sirius and Remus finished saying goodbye to Harry, Amelia moved in, and Sirius went to Susan. "You will be good now, you promise me?" Amelia asked, pulling back and looking sternly at Harry. Harry nodded before he was pulled over to Molly, who did her best to cut off his circulation as she hugged him. Harry was nearly gasping as he pulled back. Arthur clapped him on the back before Cyrus warned them that the train would depart without them. The teenagers quickly headed onto the train, giving their parents and guardians a wave goodbye.
I still can't believe it,
Sirius murmured as he watched the train pull away, precisely at 11 o'clock, like always. Amelia nodded. What happened to the little girl I used to rock to sleep at night? Sirius pulled her into his side.
Maybe we'll have another one, then so that we can do it all over again.
Amelia looked up at him, raising an eyebrow. Is that an offer? She asked archly. Sirius chuckled and leaned down to give her a kiss. Amelia smiled as she pulled back. Who knew? Maybe they would have a kid of their own. But first there was a war and a pesky megalomaniac that needed to be dealt with. Once the train pulled away from King's Cross, most of the group left Ron alone and headed up to the first car for the standard prefects meeting. Since Ron was the only one who wasn't a prefect, he would be by himself for a while. Harry and Susan spent the 15 minutes before the meeting going over a few notes and making sure they knew what they wanted to discuss. The rest of the prefects trickled in from 5 minutes before the meeting was set to begin, giving greetings to those already present as they settled in. Hannah and Justin arrived together, greeting Susan with a wave and a smile as they sat near the front. Hannah had been appointed to 7th year Hufflepuff prefect girl in Susan's stead. Terry Boot and Padma Patil, the 7th year Ravenclaw prefects, arrived soon after, and by the time the meeting started, everyone was present. Harry stood up, clearing his throat.
Morning, everyone,
he greeted, and everyone replied in kind.
First off, congratulations to our new prefects, and to everyone else, welcome back.
Susan took over from there. For those of you who don't know, which I'm sure is no one, I'm Susan and this is Harry. Our main goal is to make sure you guys are able to do your jobs. Did anyone not get the patrol schedule that we set out a few weeks ago? She asked, to a unanimous shake of the head. Everyone had gotten it. Rather than giving the schedule out at the meeting, Harry and Susan had felt it would be best to contact all prefects ahead of time to let them know when they would be patrolling. They had broken the week down and separated the year into quarters. Prefect pairs would remain in the same set quarter and change 4 times a year so that the prefects could work in different people. Each pair would patrol twice a week, and there would be 4 sets patrolling the corridors each night from half an hour before curfew until an hour and a half after curfew. Harry and Susan would partner together, and the 2 heads had mixed up ages and houses. They weren't expecting problems, since the houses mixed pretty regularly now, but they did keep in mind any issues people might have with others. There were a few prefects that knew not to get along beyond simple house dynamics. When everyone indicated they had received their schedule, Harry asked if there were any questions. No one said anything, and Harry smiled.
Great. If anyone thinks of something later, please don't hesitate to ask. We're here to help you, but most importantly, we're all here to help the student body. If something comes up, if a student comes to you with an issue, or if you have any concerns, please feel like you can come to us if you need to.
Susan nodded seriously. It's our job to ensure that the students are safe and happy. If you have an issue, please bring it to our attention so that it can be resolved. After a few minutes' silence, Harry started sorting out patrols for the train, and then dismissed the prefects for the remainder of the journey. Hannah and Justin went to start their patrol, and Harry and his friends returned to their compartment to relieve Ron of his boredom. Harry glanced at her and growled,
Why do they all have to stir?
The rest looked relatively confused, but Ginny shook her head. You're the youngest head of house in over a century, Harry. Just be glad you're not openly displaying the Gryffindor ring. Who knows what they would do if they knew about that little tidbit? Harry groaned and everyone else chuckled. When they walked into the great hall, more people were staring and whispering, but Harry resolutely ignored it, waving to Susan, Luna, Blaise and Daphne as they separated to their respective tables. He did know and somewhat understand why people were so interested. Even without him being the bloody boy who lived, Ginny was right when she had said that he was the youngest head of house. Most people didn't take on the mantle of head of their household until they were in their 40s or 50s. Wizards and witches lived much longer than muggles. Dumbledore was a testimony to that, being over a century old now. It was common for lords to pass on their titles to their heir when they reached their 80s or 90s, after which they generally spent the remaining years without the stress of being head of house brought. There were, of course, exceptions to that rule, particularly in the aftermath of the last war with Voldemort. More in Europe than in Britain. The war with Grindelwald. Many houses had to deal with vacant seats and young heads of houses, as the elder ones had been killed or otherwise incapacitated, like the Longbottoms. Harry's family had been like that. His grandfather had been killed several years before the end of the war, and James had found himself the head of House Potter at 18. Frank Longbottom had also been taken on the young role, at 20, after his own father had passed. Fortunately, it could be called that in times of illness, rather Death Eaters. Harry knew his generation was filled with teenagers who would be taking on the mantle of head of house young. Himself, Susan, Blaise, there were many of whom the last war had far-reaching consequences. The noise level in the hall dropped as Minerva led the first years in. Harry clapped for each one, mentally placing names and faces so that he could remember them later, and before he knew it, though probably much later than Ron would have liked, food was appearing in front of them. Even after 7 years, Harry was still surprised at the way food magically sprung up from the table the way it always did. Catching his thoughts, Ginny glanced over and smiled. Magic is wonderful, isn't it? Harry nodded mentally and dug into his meal. The main course was disappearing, with dessert taking its place, when Harry's attention was drawn to the head table by a loud pop. Most students looked up as well, and then burst out laughing at the scene before them.
Dumbledore was gone.
Instead, there was a large yellow parakeet with a long grey beard fluttering around in the large chair that the headmaster had been using. Through their laughter, Harry managed to catch Minerva's smug gaze. The Transfiguration Mistress nodded slightly, looking very pleased with herself. The transformation only lasted a few minutes before Dumbledore changed back with another loud pop. He shook himself off, hoping the blush would not show to the entire hall. After another minute, Dumbledore stood up, though Harry noted he did it without his normal flair. He appeared to be favouring his left side slightly. It did not seem as jovial as he usually did at the start of term feast. He did, however, try to make it seem like he had enjoyed the prank.
Yes, a wonderful start of term prank. Well done to whomever set that up.
Several of Harry's friends looked at him, remembering that they had turned the old man into a goat, but Harry just shook his head slightly, letting them know that he had had nothing to do with it. Up at the head table, Minerva's smug smile turned very self-satisfying as Dumbledore continued.
Welcome to our new students, and welcome back to the older ones.
He beamed, but it seemed a little forced to Harry.
I have a few start-of-term notices. Everyone should note that the Forbidden Forest is forbidden. Mr. Filch would like me to remind you that magic is not to be used in the corridors, and the list of banned items has grown to 502. And should anyone wish to view the list, it can be found in Mr. Filch's office.
He looked around the room, his expression growing sombre.
I know I do not need to remind anyone here of the seriousness of the situation in the magical world. Please exercise caution, and should you feel need to talk, we are here. If you do not feel comfortable coming to a professor, Mr. Potter and Miss Bones, your head boy and girl, are available as well. Now, off to bed with you all.
There was a flurry of movement as the students stood up, with prefects gathering the first years and the rest making their way to the exit. Harry followed the flow of Gryffindors up to the tower, joining the fifth-year prefects in their duties, smiling and answering their questions that the first years had. When they reached the fat lady, he gave the password, Pride, and then led everyone inside.
The passwords change monthly, he informed the first years. It usually gets posted on the notice board the day before it changes, so make sure you keep informed.
He nodded at the two fifth-year prefects and left them to complete the introduction, going over to join his friends by the fireplace.
So where do you stay now?
Ron asked curiously as Harry sat down. Harry glanced towards the staircase leading up to the dorms.
There's a room for head boy and girl in each house, he told them. When they're not in use, they disappear. Do you remember that Percy used to have a room near the bottom of the stairs when he was head boy?
Ron shook his head, but Hermione frowned thoughtfully. You're right, she commented. I remember there being a door right off the common room, but it wasn't there the next year.
Harry nodded. It's back now because there's a Gryffindor head boy. Susan will be staying in the head girl room in Hufflepuff.
They talked for a while longer before deciding to head up to bed. Harry showed them the door to his room, right off the landing before the staircase split into the boy and girls' dorms, and gave Ginny a kiss before he went to inspect his new accommodations. The room was nearly as large as the dorm he shared with his 4 year-mates for the past 6 years. It boasted a large, full-sized 4-poster bed, a wardrobe and a desk. The door to one side, which opened to reveal an ensuite. Harry changed into pyjamas and flopped down onto his bed, asleep almost instantly. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that. Oh, that was beautiful. Frank and Alice and with Neville. Oh my god, if you can't tell, I was smiling so wide during that and I nearly choked up several times. Them all get to seeing the kids off to the last year apart from Luna and Ginny. Oh my heart, that was beautiful. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care, okay? Bye!